Well, folks, we've got more return to Naxxramas Mini-Set cards to review, including some neutral cards, hunter cards, and priest cards. Kicking it off with this brand new 10 mana legendary THADDIUS monstrosity. He's a big old 10 mana 11/11 undead. He's got taunt, and your odd cost cards cost 1, and then he swaps polarity each turn. So that means each of your turns, presumably, that effect will swap over to your even cost cards cost 1, and then your odd cost cards cost 1. So depending on the turn this is lined up for you to play, it may discount a certain set of your cards and then otherwise the other subset of your cards. And in particular, you might construct your deck in a way to like, okay, I've got all these awesome odd cost cards. I've seen, say, Bran and Zola and Naxxramas, and I'm going to set up this awesome combo, you know, hitting the opponent for 16 with Bran Alex and then Zolaing it right back and hitting them again with multiple Naxxramas all at once, as long as you line him up on the proper odd cost polarity. You might have other instances like Druid, for instance, where maybe you want even cost polarity for like an Anubrakan and an Astalor. But of course, really, it's just all about this mana cheat. We know how scary mana cheat can really be in Hearthstone. Now, primarily the big difference here, though, for THADDIUS is that he is really expensive to start. You've got to figure out a way to cheat this guy into play, because, of course, if you just play him straight up for 10 mana, you don't have any mana left, unless you're a druid with Guff, of course. But that's kind of the point. You have to have ways to get extra mana on the same turn with THADDIUS to make sure you can do all these other things. And there are ways to do that, right? There are recruit style effects, maybe cheating this out of your deck. There's some things like the new undead minion, or not new anymore, but new from last set, the undead 9-drop taunt that summons undead from your deck. There's ways for paladin to cheat stuff into hand with the cavalry horn, I think it's called. You know, we've got things in warlock that can cheat some undead into play via death rattle. So there's a handful of ways to get this guy rolling for less than 10 mana. And then utilizing that extra mana to do something absolutely crazy and broken. I think another a great example actually is the Bone Lord, the 6-cost card that makes your next 3 turns your first card cost 0. So just killing that off and then starting with a 0 mana THADDIUS could set up some absolutely bonkers kinds of plays. So there are some real ways to activate this and do some craziness with it. It's just going to require, you know, a little bit of manipulation in regards to deck structure, but that's how combo decks work. And then also waiting for that exact right turn when THADDIUS is lined up correctly for the polarity, which will occasionally, I'm sure, disrupt a little bit. Like, oh God, I can't live for another turn. I need him now and he's not working. But ultimately, I think we'll still prove possible. Now, that does not mean, of course, every class or every deck, there's not going to be 10 decks that are able to do this successfully. There will probably be 1 or 2 decks max that are really able to utilize THADDIUS in a consistent enough and reliable enough way to actually be a meta deck, is my guess. So we'll probably see 1 or 2 builds where this makes sense and does something, but is probably still awkward because you got to get THADDIUS in hand. He's a one-of. They're going to be, you know, it's going to require support, whether that's drawing into him, tutoring him, cheating him out. Various angles here you have to approach THADDIUS from. So the other side of this card is perhaps in something like an Evolved Shaman. It could just be really scary when it's randomly summoned. So Evolved Shaman is hitting this fairly often as a 10-drop. That's kind of something to keep an eye out for, is THADDIUS as well. Even if he's not running a deck in that instance, could still be really important in that regard. So ultimately, you know, the 10 mana challenge here is pretty high for THADDIUS, but when the effect pays off this strongly and this powerfully, decks usually find excuses to run cards like this, and I do think THADDIUS will find himself a home in a pretty powerful deck in one way or another. This discount is just too significant to not see some degree of play. So our other neutral legendary here is Rivendare War Rider. This one got revealed yesterday. I didn't want to do a whole video for a single card, so we're picking it up today. This is an alternate win condition card. We don't see too many of these in Hearthstone. But Rivendare is a 6 mana 6/6 undead. Death rattle. Shuffle the other 3 horsemen into your deck. Each of those horsemen has a base keyword, taunt, rush, or lifesteal, and the death rattle that reads: if you had all 4 horsemen die this game, destroy the enemy hero. So get all of these into play, kill them off, and boom goes the opponent, and you just win the game without actually having to deal any damage. But of course, That's not really all that easy of a task because you got to spend 24 mana worth of stuff here if you play these honestly. And there are some ways to cheese this, particularly in wild format. People have focused in on a card like Flark's Boomzooka, something we probably thought we'd never talk about again, but that summons 3 minions from your deck and kills them off for you. So that could be a way to do it really easily in wild. In standard, of course, I think it's going to require a little bit more work. There are some ways to kind of stack the deck in your favor, quite literally, with cards like Order in the Court for Paladin, or maybe you could put all of these on the top of your deck and then just try to play them as quickly as possible. I still think that's a pretty iffy game plan. Number one, just playing 6 mana 6/6s doesn't really keep up in modern day Hearthstone. Even with these keywords, these are still going to be really slow and clunky to get into play, and it's going to be hard for a lot of decks to keep up playing these. On top of that, of course, these are susceptible to disruption. Any sort of polymorph effect, getting rid of any of them is going to ruin it because all 4 have to have died if they're transformed. They don't die. Alternatively, if the opponent's silence is the final one, there won't be that death rattle anymore to activate unless you pull it out from somewhere later, like a Xyrella or something. You'd still have to have all 4 die, but it would be a second chance on that death rattle, essentially. But, you know, susceptible to disruption, that means it's going to be very awkward, very clunky, very slow to pull this off. Now, I do think there's potentially a world where control decks who don't have a great way to end games, who don't have any sort of typical lethality, and they're worried about beating other control decks. So, you know, 2 Blood Death Knights going at it, right, for 40 minutes. Having a card like this in your deck could be a way to ensure that you have a reliable way to end games in those really greedy, grindy matchups, like control versus control. So there could be some sort of prisoner's dilemma sort of scenario where control decks kind of have to toss this in just in case the other control deck has it. I think it would require really specific metas for that to be necessary, because sometimes it's not worth, you know, running a bad card for that 5% matchup when you run into other control decks. You'd rather just run good cards for your good matchups or to beat aggro, whatever it might be, your most common matchups. But there is a possibility there that Rivendare pops in just as a necessity to help you close out games and kind of race to that Rivendare win condition in mirror matches of sorts. So ultimately, really fun looking meme card. I can't wait to try this out. It's going to be really fun to try to pull this off, but I do not think it's going to be very reliable or consistent for most decks to achieve it with Rivendare here. So probably not a card that's a meta tyrant in any way, but still a really fun one. So next up here, we have the Lost Exarch. This is a new 4 mana 5/4 undead with a pretty neat death rattle here. Spend all your mana, summon that many 2/2 zombies with Rush. So the way this is going to work is, right, if you play this out on 4 mana, you'd have 0 mana left over. If your opponent killed it, nothing would happen. But if you, say, played this on your turn 6 and you floated that 2 additional mana, when you pass the turn back to your opponent, you're still going to have that 2 mana left over during your opponent's turn. And if they kill the Lost Exarch while you're floating that 2 mana, it will summon 2 2/2 zombies with Rush, and you'll get a nice little bonus death rattle. And then alternatively, if your opponent doesn't kill it and it rolls back and it's turn 7 for you, and then you trade in the Lost Exarch, it's going to spend all 7 of your mana and summon you some 2/2 zombies with Rush. And in Arena, that sounds absolutely insane to me. Like, that just seems like a bonkers Arena card to get like this full instantly reactive board, basically, without having to use any resources. So you maintain card advantage while still being able to do stuff on board. That sounds just obscenely good, as I understand Arena. I don't play much, of course. In standard format, I think that's going to feel a little bit too niche. I don't think you're going to want to risk it with those sorts of things. I think very often you want to spend all of your mana. There's not going to be a lot of worthwhile scenarios floating 2 or 3 mana to try to get a decent death rattle on this card, when you could just run other 4-drops that have built-in guaranteed effects that are really synergistic for you. So even in something like a token undead deck that's looking to go really wide or have some sticky death rattles, I have a feeling there are just going to be better ways to do that more consistently. And whatever advantages the Lost Exarch has here to kind of fill in your mana for you or preserve resources doesn't really feel relevant to me in standard format. So I really think this card's pretty fringe, if anything, in standard, but maybe one of those just absolutely obscene cards in Arena, as I see it anyway. So next up here we have Mistake, a new Amalgam card, a 1 mana 1/3 with all minion types. And this card's really clever because I had this Twitter exchange a while ago where I was making fun of this really erotically charged copy pasta that showed up on my YouTube, and I said dual type minions were absolutely a mistake. And Hearthstone developer Celestalon replied, nah, the minion that's really a mistake is in the mini set, and it's literally a mistake, which is just crazy. What a teaser we didn't know was coming. And I gotta say, the artwork on this guy is really cool. This might be my favorite amalgam artwork so far. Now, in regards to the actual playability of this card, I'm a little bit less hopeful for this one than I've seen some of people's takes so far. A lot of people seem really excited about this card and think it has a lot of promise. I'm not quite as convinced. I think the fact that this is a jack of all trades is great in theory, but in reality, I think a lot of decks that care about minion types probably have enough options or better options that suit their specific goals. So for instance, you know, a couple examples, if you look like Naga, for instance, there's the Vicious Slither Spear, which is the insane 1/3 that scales with spells. That's way better than Mistake. The only upside this card has is that it is the minion type or multiple minion types. It doesn't have some other bonus sort of effect. If we look at like Undead, you know, there's Arms Dealer, for instance, or Death Knight has like Body Bagger. These cards that are very similar in size, but have some sort of really strong bonus effect that's going to be really beneficial for that specific minion type. And, you know, right now decks don't really have a hard time filling in on those extra slots. You know, maybe the Tunnel Trogs of the world get cut and Mistake takes a place in some of those aggro decks, but even Tunnel Trog, despite not being a minion type focus, has a really beneficial effect again for a 1-drop. And I worry that just having multiple minion types is not going to be a reason for Mistake. There are some specific examples that make me a little more hopeful. Things like totems, you know, maybe just having a 1/3 totem is really nice to build off of for totem synergies because they just don't have a lot of options or otherwise upsides, and having attack value on a totem's pretty cool. So I don't want to write it off completely. I just don't think this is that going to be everywhere sort of card that I've seen a lot of people suggest it might be so far. I think it's going to be actually pretty limited in its use cases. I think most decks will simply have better options. So next up here is the Dark Fallen Shadow. This guy is a new 3-mana 3/3 undead with Rush and Mana Thirst 6, gain Reborn. And boy, this just does not seem very good to me. 3-mana 3/3 Rush simply does not keep up in modern day Hearthstone. That is not competitive enough. It's just not big enough and really expensive. Think about Wild Paw Knowles, right? That's the sort of Rush minions we're playing. That's a 0-mana 3/5 that enables all kinds of other stuff right now. That's obviously been a very, very good card, but this one's so far away that it's really not even close. And of course, the Mana Thirst 6 aspect here that makes this card interesting comes along too late. By the time you get to turn 6, a 3-mana 3/3 with Reborn is really not that interesting. You know, it's that old Restless Mummy sort of vibe, a little cheaper at 3 mana, but of course, it's only that after turn 6, which is really not going to be as relevant. So no, this deck is not specialized enough to make a cut, even in an undead deck. I think probably a fine arena card once again, but not the sort of thing we'd ever expect to see in standard Hearthstone. So next up, we've got a new Hunter secret here, Zombies, which is so freaking clever. I love it so much. 2-mana spell, of course. After your opponent plays a minion, summon 4 1/1 zombies to attack it. And the zombies confirmed are beast and undead dual type minions. So some potential synergies there for both undead decks and beast decks that might want to have some wide board plays, because you can get some leftover zombies in this card. Unlike a card like Snipe, which this compares to pretty closely, if this overkills a minion, if your opponent plays a 1/2 into the zombies, you're going to have a couple zombies left over, because 2 will trade in to kill the unit, and then 2 won't have anything to attack, and they'll be left behind on board, which of course can be great for any synergies like that, where you're trying to kill stuff off or just have some minions left over. And I think that makes this a better Snipe in 99% of scenarios. It handles Divine Shields better. It's better if it overkills, because you just get extra stuff on board. Can even like trigger any sort of minion death effects as well. So variety of reasons, this just feels like a much better Snipe in a majority of scenarios. And I think that means this card's going to be pretty good. I think this will be a great option, both in secret packages and maybe even beyond them. Next up, we have the Trinket Tracker here. This is a new 1-mana 1/1 undead with Battlecry, draw a 1-cost spell. So Nice little cheap cycle card here that's tutoring for low cost spells in particular. This might be nice with some of the arcane spells we've got currently in Hunter. There's a couple good 1 mana options, and in particular sort of filling your hand up with your arcane spells and then playing some of that like arcane spell damage hand buff stuff to follow it up might be a nice way to populate your hand and reward some of those other arcane synergies. So you could see this being a great enabler in that case. And then, frankly, sometimes just grabbing a tracking might make this card really good. Just having this into tracking to make sure that you have the ability to discover good cards in your deck. That actually sounds like a pretty good play in its own right. You know, I know this doesn't compare super well to something like Knight of Anointment in Paladin, which, you know, that is able to tutor holy spells. And what that means is it can actually grab higher value things. This kind of has a cap, only ever able to grab you a 1-cost thing. So it's never going to be that big or that valuable or that crazy. Whereas the Knight of Anointment can grab you something awesome and big and really significant, perhaps. But it doesn't have to be. Knight of Anointment's a great card, and this can be a pretty good card, even if it's worse than something like that on a 1-to-1 comparison. But even then, in Hunter specifically, this card still, I think, offers some really nice utility. And the fact that it has some more narrow specificity in its tutoring aspect can actually be beneficial as well if you're trying to get a bunch of cheap cards altogether. Something like Quest Hunter, for instance, would love having a bunch of cheap spells in hand. That's going to rotate before too long, but still, for now, that might be an option for this one, as well as the Arcane package. And then last for Hunter here, we have Faithful Companions, a new 7-mana spell. This one allows you to discover a beast from your deck and summon it. So yes, that means you can grab a King Crush and summon it and whack your opponent. And Mana Thirst 10 also summon a copy of it. So yes, that means you can grab 2 King Crushes and whack your opponent for 16 damage here. And there are also some other good beasts, perhaps just big, scary stuff. You know, the mountain bears and the hydralodons and so on might be decent here off Faithful Companions. We've seen already, you know, Big Beast Hunter be a successful deck over the last year or so, really, driven by cards like Harpoon Gun in particular, helping you cheat beasts into play. Now, that said, Faithful Companions here actually compares pretty unfavorably, I think, to a lot of what Beast Hunter has already done. I think, you know, the option to grab a specific beast is nice, but it's coming along a little late and you're spending 7 mana on it. That doesn't feel great to me. And yeah, the Mana Thirst is nice, but once you get to turn 10, man, you're so far along. You've got to have big, crazy plays. I guess grabbing 2 King Crushes is pretty big, but still, you're going to be sitting on this card in hand a lot. It's going to feel awkward a lot. You're going to want to play it on 7 because you're desperate a lot, and then it's not that good on 7. So this really does feel a little slow and clunky to me. I could maybe see this as a one of in a big beast deck, particularly, you know, post rotation, if there just aren't a lot of ways to play bigger beast cards, but you still want to try. Yeah, it's fine. I ultimately think, though, this is still pretty expensive, and Big Beast Hunter has done much better when cheating those 7-mana cards into play on turn 4, turn 5, etc., as opposed to just more honestly perhaps on turn 7. But also keep an eye out if there's other just gigantic beasts, awesome 10-mana beasts that this can cheat into play a few mana early. That could be another way for this card to see some play. So now we're going to move over to Priest cards, kicking it off with the Rotting Necromancer. This is a 4-mana 5/4 with a Battlecry Dredge. If it's an undead, deal 5 damage to the enemy hero, and this itself is also undead. So actually a pretty big damage dealing card here. Big stat line as well for 4 mana. And if you're running an undead deck with a high undead consistency, you know, being able to, number one, pick a good card, because Dredge we know is a useful effect in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily need that much support to make it awesome, but I think this is pretty good support, just extra damage. We've already seen some undead aggressive priests doing fairly well in this most recent meta, and using this as a finisher or just a nice mid-game play to whittle down the opponent, I think that looks pretty good, actually. And I like Dredge, too, to help you fill your curve. You know, grab something big. Frankly, grab another one of these. Sounds pretty good as well. Just create a little chain of some big damage potential here off the Rotting Necromancers. I kind of like that. I think this is the shape of card that might actually make some sense in that kind of deck. I haven't played it a ton, so this might be awkward from a mana cost standpoint, but I think that the power output here is high enough and the stats are good enough. Combined with Dredge, that's pretty good, right? I actually do like this card quite a bit. So next up, we actually have even more priest damage cards. This is Mind Seer, a new 1-mana shadow spell. Deal 2 damage to a minion. If it dies, deal 3 damage to the enemy hero. So this is like Touch of the Naxxramas, but swapped up to deal damage instead of restore health, which is kind of funny. Priest is getting the damage when Warlock's getting the healing when it makes sense sometimes, but kind of interesting. But anyway, this is a pretty efficient card. We've seen how good Touch of the Naxxramas can feel, just tidying up little boards, keeping the game rolling. And this is the kind of the opposite side of it, right? Like this is saying, hey, I've developed some early minions. I've got some pressure rolling. I want to make sure to keep my board in tip-top shape. I don't want you to have little stuff that's going to trade into my board, and I'm still looking to whittle your health down. So I'm just going to work through your board with cards like Mindseer, chip away your health, and create some nice lethality. Not to mention, if you're running a bunch of small minions yourself, even if your opponent doesn't have stuff, there might be scenarios where you use this on your own cards. And just use this as a nice finisher if needed, particularly if you've got some void touched attendants down on board that are scaling this up to 4, maybe even 5 damage off multiples of them. I could see that being a nice little way to end a game. So I think this card looks honestly rather efficient. Good little removal bundled with damage, and the flexibility to hit your own minions is probably not insignificant on this one. And then our final card for the video here is Cannibalize, a new 4-mana spell. This looks cool in the artwork, by the way. It's really awesome dark artwork. New shadow spell, destroy a minion, restore its health to all friendly characters. So we've got another card in the 4-mana assassinate bracket, but with some upside here. And honestly, that's some pretty significant health gain sometimes. If you need to kill a big card, imagine how swingy it would be to remove your opponent's 8/8 or whatever and also restore 8 health to your hero. If you're trying to play a longer game plan, a more control deck for Priest, that feels like it's a rather nice tool to have. And, you know, Priest doesn't typically have too much trouble spending mana to fill turns and just stall things out into bigger plays later. So this is a little bit pricey compared to a lot of Priest removal, but because it's bundling in that survivability, I think they're going to be able to sustain that and be able to spend 4 mana on a card like this one. Ultimately, it will likely depend on the meta you're in and how many threats are developed that feel good enough to spend 4 mana to clear. You know, if there aren't any big 8/8s and stuff on turn 4 and the meta is instead a bunch of 3/3s on board on turn 4, obviously this is not the shape of card that's going to feel very good. But I could envision other metas where people are cheating out something really big. You know, Evolved Shaman is making this awesome giant minion on turn 4. A card like Cannibalize is probably going to feel really good. There is a question, will the health restoring actually matter by turn 4? But I think decks are fast enough these days where very often you're going to take some chip damage early and the Cannibalize will still be a meaningful heal at that point. And then of course later in a game still has some utility, I'm sure. One interesting angle as well for this is that it's kind of a life gain and defensive card that's shadow. Sometimes we see most of the life gain cards limited to holy. There's a few examples, of course, that escape that mold. But you could maybe see a shadow deck that needs some survivability or needs a little bit more control tools or removal, and something like Cannibalize could fill in that slot rather nicely if you're trying to get like the shadow hero power off Benedictus, but you still want some survivability tools. So that's an interesting angle for Cannibalize as well. THADDIUS Monstrosity is a 4-star card. Rivendare War Rider is a 3-star card. Lost Exarch is a 2-star card. Mistake is a 3-star card. Dark Fallen Shadow is a 1-star card. Zombies is a 4-star card. Trinket Tracker is a 4-star card. Faithful Companions is a 2-star card. Rotting Necromancer is a 4-star card. Mindseer is a 4-star card. Cannibalize is a 3-star card. So there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this particular review. Some interesting cards for sure in the class set. Some of the neutrals I'm left wanting a little bit as far as their utility is concerned. But if you like these cards more than me, I'm curious to hear those thoughts. I want you to talk me into it. That said, really excited to play this card. Looks super fun. Really excited to play this card. Looks super fun. So some big fun opportunities, some build around, some great experimental stuff, even if not always the most competitive. But I do think these Priest cards look intriguing, and a couple of these Hunter cards seem promising as well. And Rivendare seems very, very enjoyable. We're going to play this one a lot. So share those thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more reviews. I think we got a couple more days of card reviews. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.